guys, and welcome to Whispered Histories. Go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's just float back in time for a little while. Tonight, we're not going to be talking about epic battles or, really, anything remotely exciting. Instead, we're going to drift down the Nile and take a quiet look at how the ancient Egyptians handled the very human business of love, marriage, and everything in between. We tend to think of ancient Egypt in grand terms. You know, giant pyramids, golden masks, gods with animal heads. The whole dramatic package. But when you peel back the layers of sandstone and papyrus, you find people. Just people. People who fell in love. People who got on each other's nerves. People who worried about who their kids would marry. It's all surprisingly normal. And of course, a little bit weird. Because history is never, not at least a little bit weird. So let's begin our journey, not with a pharaoh, but with an ordinary person. Let's picture a young woman, maybe living in a village of tomb builders near the Valley of the Kings. Her life is simple, rhythmic. The sun rises, the men go to work, the women manage the household. And in this predictable world, love wasn't some grand dramatic affair. It was practical. But that doesn't mean it was without feeling. Far from it. The ancient Egyptians were surprisingly romantic. Archaeologists have found dozens of love poems scribbled on bits of pottery and papyrus that sound, well, they sound like they could have been written yesterday. One poor guy describes himself as being so lovesick for a girl that even if the chief physicians came to him, their remedies would do nothing. He says his illness can't be diagnosed, which is probably the most dramatic way of saying she hasn't texted back that I've ever heard. Another poem talks about a man so determined to see his beloved that he wades into the crocodile-infested Nile, declaring that her love makes him strong enough to walk on the water, which is a bold move. You have to respect the commitment. These poems paint a picture of genuine affection. They talk about longing, about the beauty of a loved one's voice, about how seeing them is better than eating or drinking. Couples in tomb paintings and statues are often shown in tender poses, holding hands, with a wife's arm wrapped gently around her husband's shoulders. There was a real emphasis on companionship. It wasn't all just about securing a bloodline or merging family property, though that was certainly part of it. For the average Egyptian, getting married was a fairly low-key event. There wasn't a big religious or state ceremony. Basically, a man would reach an agreement with a girl's family, often with the exchange of some gifts, and then she would just move into his house. That was it. She'd pack up her belongings, there might be a small party, and boom, they were married. The main event was the establishment of a shared household. The phrase for getting married was literally to set up a house. It was a social arrangement, plain and simple. Girls from peasant families might marry as young as 12 or 13, while boys were usually a bit older, maybe 16 to 20. The idea was that a man needed to be established enough to actually support a family. Unmarried men were apparently seen as incomplete, which sounds like the kind of thing your ancient Egyptian aunt would say at a family gathering. Now, what makes ancient Egyptian marriage really interesting especially for the time, is the legal status of women. In a world where women were often treated as property, Egyptian women had a surprising number of rights. They could own property in their own name. They could run businesses. They could represent themselves in court. And they could even initiate a divorce. This was pretty revolutionary compared to, say, ancient Greece, where women were perpetual legal minors. When a woman married, she often brought a dowry, which could be anything from furniture and linens to property. And according to the marriage agreements, which started to become more common in later periods, anything she brought into the marriage remained her property. These weren't so much romantic documents as they were practical economic contracts. They were often called annuity contracts and were extremely advantageous to the wife. The husband would pledge to provide for his wife a certain amount of grain, oil for clothing, and so on. And if he divorced her, he had to pay her a fine and return her dowry. If she divorced him, however, there was no fine. It was a system designed to ensure a woman wasn't left destitute if the marriage fell apart. And divorces did happen. The process was as simple as getting married. One spouse would declare the end of the union in front of witnesses, and they'd divide their joint property. The wife was typically entitled to 1/3 of the assets acquired during the marriage, and the children usually went with her. Both parties were then free to remarry. It was all handled with a level of pragmatism that feels almost modern. Of course, there were limits. Adultery, especially on the part of the wife, was taken very seriously. The punishments could be severe, including, in some cases, stoning or burning at the stake. It's a little less clear what happened to men who are unfaithful, which is not surprising, historically speaking. For the most part, though, non-royal marriages were expected to be monogamous. The wisdom literature of the time encouraged husbands to treat their wives well, to love them and provide for them. One sage, Ptahhotep, advised, "Love your wife and make her happy as long as you live." It was good advice then, and it's good advice now. Children were, of course, highly valued. They were seen as a blessing, and couples who couldn't conceive would pray to the gods for help, or even write letters to their dead relatives, asking them to intervene from the afterlife. If all else failed, adoption was also an option. Family was the absolute core of Egyptian society. The nuclear family unit was so fundamental that even their gods were often arranged in family groups, like Osiris, Isis, and their son Horus. So for the common person, life along the Nile was defined by these simple, powerful bonds. A life of shared work, mutual respect, and the hope of raising a family that would care for you in your old age and ensure your proper burial. It was a world where love was expressed in quiet gestures and heartfelt poetry, and where marriage was a practical partnership, buttressed by surprisingly fair legal protections for women. It's a gentle, almost serene picture. But as we drift further up the river, toward the glittering palaces of Thebes and Amarna, things start to get complicated. The rules that apply to the common folk, well, they didn't exactly apply to the pharaohs. For the royals, marriage wasn't just about setting up a house. It was about setting up a dynasty. And that's where things get really weird. Let's float over to the royal court, shall we? Where the stakes are higher, the family trees are tangled, and the concept of a normal relationship gets thrown right out the window. The pharaoh was not just a king. He was considered a living god. And to maintain the purity of that divine bloodline, a very specific, and to us, very strange marital practice was common: incest. While it wasn't allowed for the general population, royalty frequently married within the family. A pharaoh would often marry his sister or half-sister to secure the throne. This was done to emulate the gods, particularly the story of Osiris and his sister wife Isis, who were central figures in Egyptian mythology. The idea was that the great royal wife, the pharaoh's principal consort, needed to have the purest royal blood, and who had purer blood than his own sister? This practice, of course, had some consequences. Generations of inbreeding led to a host of genetic problems that plagued the royal lines, but we'll get to that a little later. For now, let's just sit with the strangeness of it. A young prince growing up, knowing that one of his sisters would likely be his future queen. It casts a very different light on family dynamics. Pharaohs also practiced polygamy, which was another royal perk not extended to the general population. A king would have one great royal wife who held a distinct and powerful position, but he would also have a harem of minor wives and concubines. These marriages were often political, used to seal alliances with foreign powers or noble families within Egypt. A Hittite princess might be sent to the Egyptian court, laden with gifts, to become a secondary wife and ensure peace between the two empires. These women would live in the royal harem, a separate palace complex, and while they might have enjoyed a life of luxury, they held little. They're shown riding in chariots together, making offerings to the Aten together, and in one famous relief, they're shown in a casual family scene with their young daughters perched on their laps. Akhenaten is even depicted kissing one of his daughters. It's a tender, human portrayal that stands in stark contrast to the stiff, formal art of previous pharaohs. They seem like a genuinely devoted family. But then you dig a little deeper, and the weirdness starts to bubble up. Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters, no sons, which, for a dynasty, is a problem. And it seems that in his quest for a male heir, Akhenaten took things to a disturbing extreme. There is evidence to suggest that he married at least 2 of his own daughters, Meritaten and Ankhesenaten, who would later be known as Ankhesenamun. It's unclear if these were full, consummated marriages or purely ceremonial titles, but the fact remains that he took his own children as his wives. Imagine being one of those daughters. First, your father upends the entire religious structure of the country, moving the capital to a new city in the desert called Amarna. Then, your mother, Nefertiti, seems to vanish from the historical record around the year 12 of his reign. The reasons are unclear. Did she die? Was she disgraced? Did she take on a new role as a co-regent? We just don't know. And then, your father marries you. It's a level of family dysfunction that's hard to comprehend. And it's into this strange, intense, and frankly creepy family situation that the most famous pharaoh of all is born, Tutankhamun, the boy king. DNA evidence has shown that Tutankhamun was the son of Akhenaten, but not with Nefertiti. His mother was one of Akhenaten's other wives, a woman who is referred to in inscriptions as the younger lady, and who was, get this, Akhenaten's own sister. So Tutankhamun was the product of a brother-sister union, and his family tree was about to get even more tangled. When Akhenaten died, the country was in turmoil. His religious revolution had not been popular, and there was a power vacuum. After a couple of very brief, shadowy reigns, the young Tutankhamun ascended the throne, probably around the age of 9 or 10. And who did he marry to solidify his claim? His own half-sister, Ankhesenamun, one of the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She was about 13 at the time, so we have a 10-year-old king married to his 13-year-old half-sister, both of them the children of a pharaoh who married his sisters and his daughters. It's a genetic and domestic mess. And yet, just like with her parents, the art depicting Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun is incredibly tender and romantic. On the back of his famous golden throne, there's a scene of Ankhesenamun rubbing perfumed ointment onto her young husband's shoulder. Other images show them hunting together, or her handing him flowers. They're consistently portrayed as a devoted, loving couple. Two children trying to rule an empire while navigating an incredibly strange family legacy. Their marriage, however, was marked by tragedy. In Tutankhamun's tomb, archaeologists found the mummified remains of two premature baby girls. They were the couple's stillborn daughters, the only children they are known to have had. The line of succession was once again hanging by a thread. The pressure on this young couple must have been immense. And then, around the age of 18 or 19, Tutankhamun died suddenly. Ankhesenamun, now a widow in her early 20s, was left in an incredibly vulnerable position. She was the last remaining royal of the Amarna line, and without a husband, her own power was precarious. What happened next is one of the most bizarre and desperate episodes in Egyptian history. Ankhesenamun apparently wrote a letter to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's great rival. In this letter, she says, "My husband has died and I have no son. They say you have many sons. If you would give me one of your sons, he would become my husband." She goes on to say she is afraid, and that she is loath to take one of her servants and make him her husband. This was an unprecedented move. With her plan in ruins, Ankhesenamun was forced to marry the very servant she had dreaded. She married Ai, her own grandfather. It was a move that secured Ai's claim to the throne. But for Ankhesenamun, it was the final tragic chapter. Shortly after the marriage, she disappears completely from the historical record. There is no mention of her in Ai's tomb. Her own fate, whether she died naturally or was quietly eliminated, is unknown. It's a sad, lonely end for a woman who was born a princess, married her brother, and tried to defy tradition to hold on to her power. This is the world of royal marriage in Egypt, a world of divine right and dynastic ambition, where love, if it existed, was a fragile thing, easily crushed by the weight of politics and tradition. It was a world where a family tree could look more like a tangled wreath. Let's now move forward in time to the reign of perhaps the most powerful and prolific pharaoh of all, Ramesses the Great. If you thought Akhenaten family was complicated, just wait. Ramesses took royal marriage and fatherhood to a whole new level. Ramesses II ruled for an astonishing 67 years. He was a master builder, a formidable warrior, and a propagandist of the highest order. His face is on countless temples and statues across Egypt, and he had a lot of children, over 100 of them, in fact. By some counts, he had 96 sons and 60 daughters. He had at least 8 royal wives, and a massive harem of concubines. His first and most beloved wife was Nefertari. Just as Akhenaten had done with Nefertiti, Ramesses made his love for Nefertari a public spectacle. He built her a magnificent temple at Abu Simbel, right next to his own colossal one. Inside, an inscription reads, "Nefertari, for whose sake the very sun does shine." In the art, she is depicted as being the same size as her husband, a sign of her equal status, which was highly unusual. Wives were typically shown as small figures at their husband's feet. They appear to have had a genuinely happy and long-lasting marriage, and she was his great royal wife for over 2 decades. But Nefertari was just one piece of the puzzle. Ramesses also had another prominent wife named Isetnofret, who seems to have been married to him around the same time as Nefertari. There was likely a rivalry between the two women and their children, as their sons were the primary contenders for the throne. And then there were his other wives. Remember the royal tradition of marrying your relatives? Ramesses embraced it with gusto. He married at least 4, possibly 5, of his own daughters, making them his royal wives. 3 of these daughters, Bintanath, Meritamen, and Nabatawi, were given the title of Great Royal Wife after their mothers either passed away or retired from the role. Again, it's a concept that is deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities, but for Ramesses, it was simply how you maintain the purity and power of the royal line. It was tradition. The sheer scale of his family is mind-boggling. Imagine the court politics, the jockeying for position among his dozens of sons, each one hoping to be named the successor. Ramesses outlived many of his children, including his first 12 sons. The throne eventually passed to his 13th son, Merempha, who was already an old man by the time his father finally died. The lives of Ramesses, many wives and daughters, were a strange mix of privilege and constraint. They lived in unimaginable luxury, but their lives were dictated by the needs of the state and the pharaoh. The foreign princesses sent to his harem would likely never see their homes again. His own daughters were used as instruments of dynastic succession, married to their own father to produce more royal heirs. It's a world away from the simple farmers exchanging gifts and setting up a house together. For the royals, marriage was a tool of power, a way to